Kings are remembered in statues and songs, but not all deserve their glory. Some were cruel, others careless, and a few so reckless that their own thrones collapsed beneath them. From palaces dripping with gold to battlefields soaked in blood, history tells of rulers who became warnings instead of legends. Tonight, we'll journey through their downfall, the worst kings in history, and the shadows they left behind. Let the crown grow heavy, and let the past whisper you to sleep. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like and subscribe. But if you really like what I'm doing here, let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. Where are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? It's always happy to see who is joining us from around the world. So dim your light, let the world quiet down, and get comfortable. We begin in silence. Caligula's madness. 37 to Anaradi CE. The year was 37 CE, and the Roman Empire stood at the height of its strength. From the windswept coasts of Britannia to the sun-baked deserts of Egypt, from the vineyards of Gaul to the bustling markets of Judea, the empire's reach seemed endless. Rome was a city of marble and power, where senators debated in cool colonnades and legionaries marched with the thunder of iron upon stone. And into this world of grandeur stepped Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, known more widely by the nickname Caligula, which meant little boots, a title once given when, as a boy, he wandered the camps of soldiers dressed in a miniature uniform. They adored him then, the charming child of the respected General Germanicus. Few could have imagined that this same figure would, within a few short years, be remembered as one of history's most infamous rulers. Caligula began his reign with promise. After the suspicious death of his predecessor Tiberius, the Roman people welcomed him with a joy that bordered on relief. Tiberius had been stern, reclusive, and often cruel. Caligula seemed to be the opposite, a young man full of energy, vigor, and charisma. The first months of his reign were filled with generous gifts to the people. He granted bonuses to the soldiers who had adored his father, staged lavish games in the Circus Maximus, and ordered the release of prisoners accused of treason under Tiberius's paranoia. Rome, weary of suspicion and austerity, seemed to bloom again in the light of a youthful emperor who promised a golden age. But the tide of admiration turned quickly. Within the first year of his reign, Caligula fell gravely ill. Ancient sources such as Suetonius and Cassius Dio describe how he nearly died, his court waiting anxiously as days passed. When he recovered, something in him seemed altered, as though the fever had burned away any remaining restraint. Some historians suggest the illness left him mentally unstable. Others believe it merely revealed traits that had been lurking all along. Whatever the truth, the Rome that had once cheered him began to whisper, and soon to fear. Caligula's extravagance was the first sign. He spent with abandon, draining the treasury that Tiberius had carefully guarded. He ordered construction projects that seemed less about utility than about spectacle. Ships with gilded hulls that floated like palaces upon the sea, games and festivals that lasted for days, and statues of himself erected across the empire. He insisted on being worshipped not merely as emperor, but as a living god, demanding temples and priests in his name. In Alexandria, where Egyptian tradition already blurred the line between mortal kings and divine beings, he declared himself the new pharaoh, binding Roman authority to ancient god-kings. In Rome itself, he had statues of himself dressed as Jupiter, Mars, and Apollo, striding in divine glory. He even sought to place a massive statue of himself in the Temple of Jerusalem, a decision that provoked outrage among the Jewish population, who saw such idolatry as a direct desecration. The cruelty soon followed. Caligula's temper was legendary, his whims dangerous. At banquets, he was said to laugh at the sight of senators squirming, unsure whether his next joke would end in favour or execution. Ancient tales speak of him inviting guests to dine, then casually having them killed, their property seized to fund his excesses. He mocked senators, calling them slaves, and even appointed his horse, Incitatus, to a position of honour, allegedly planning to make the animal a consul. Whether this was true or simply a symbol of contempt, the message was clear. He held the Roman Senate in disdain, seeing them as playthings rather than partners in governance. The empire, for all its grandeur, was not untouched by his chaos. Caligula demanded military campaigns that bordered on absurdity. In 39 CE, he marched legions to the northern coast of Gaul, supposedly preparing to invade Britannia. But instead of war, he ordered his soldiers to collect seashells, declaring them spoils of the ocean, trophies of his victory over Neptune, the god of the sea. The soldiers, baffled and humiliated, complied, carrying baskets of shells back to Rome as if they were golden treasures. To the people, this was madness. To Caligula, it was triumph. Yet the cruelty ran deeper still. He persecuted those closest to him, even his own family. He had his cousin Gemellus executed, despite having once named him as heir. His grandmother, Antonia Minor, is said to have died by his command after she rebuked his behavior. His sisters, once honored and celebrated, fell victim to suspicion and punishment. What had begun as the rule of a beloved young emperor devolved into the tyranny of a man whose fear and paranoia made no one safe. Still, amid this chaos, life in Rome carried on. The markets bustled with trade, the theatres filled with laughter and applause, and the legions patrolled distant frontiers. But beneath the surface, there was unease. Senators muttered in private chambers, their loyalty brittle. Soldiers obeyed orders, but their respect waned. Common citizens gossiped in the baths, trading stories of the emperor's latest eccentricity. Fear was everywhere, a shadow that stretched across the empire as long as Caligula lived. By 41 CE, the shadow fell upon him. The Praetorian Guard, the elite soldiers sworn to protect the emperor, had grown weary of his insults and brutality. Led by Cassius Chaerea, a plot was hatched. On a January day, as Caligula made his way through a palace corridor, the guards struck, swords flashed, and the emperor fell, his cries swallowed by the clash of steel. The man once adored as Rome's golden hope, the child of Germanicus, the little boots who had charmed soldiers, now lay dead at the hands of those meant to shield him. His reign had lasted just 4 years. The aftermath was swift. The Senate considered restoring the Republic, so disgusted were they by the excesses of imperial rule. But the empire had grown too vast, too dependent on a single ruler. Instead, Caligula's uncle Claudius was raised to the purple, a quiet, bookish man who had lived in the shadows until that moment. Rome carried on, its rhythm unbroken, though the memory of Caligula's madness lingered like a scar. He became a warning etched into history, a reminder of how absolute power, unchecked by reason or restraint, could unravel even the greatest empire. And so, as the city returned to its daily life, the clatter of chariots on stone, the murmur of voices in the forum, the prayers offered to Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill, the story of Caligula became both nightmare and lesson. For though empires rise with strength and promise, they can be undone as easily by the flaws of one man as by the armies of 1,000 enemies. Nero and the Burning City, 5468 CE. The year was 54 CE, and the Roman Empire once again stood at a crossroads of promise and uncertainty. Claudius, the scholarly emperor who had restored stability after Caligula's downfall, had breathed his last. Into the corridors of power stepped his young stepson, Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, better known to history as Nero. He was not yet 17, a boy cloaked suddenly in purple, crowned with responsibility that would have tested the wisdom of men thrice his age. Rome, weary but hopeful, watched with cautious curiosity. Some saw in him the freshness of youth, the possibility of new beginnings. Others whispered of the dangers of inexperience, of a mind too easily shaped by those who lingered in the shadows of power. At first, the promise seemed real. Nero's earliest years as emperor were guided by capable hands. His tutor, the philosopher Seneca, whose words still echo across centuries, counseled moderation and justice. The commander Burrus, head of the Praetorian Guard, steered him toward prudence and stability. Under their watchful eyes, the empire thrived. Taxes were lightened, public entertainments were offered generously, and justice seemed tempered by compassion rather than cruelty. Rome, for a time, breathed easily. Citizens whispered that perhaps the youth might grow into wisdom, that perhaps the empire had found not only a ruler, but a guardian. Yet, within the walls of the palace, darker currents stirred. Nero's mother, Agrippina the Younger, daughter of the beloved Germanicus and sister of Caligula, had long schemed to place her son upon the throne. Fierce, ambitious, and commanding, she had guided every step of his rise. But once Nero wore the crown, she sought not to yield her power, but to share it. The young emperor found himself overshadowed by a woman whose influence seemed greater than his own. The Senate, the army, even the provinces looked to her as the true force behind the throne. To a youth whose pride was fragile, the presence of such dominance was unbearable. The struggle between mother and son soon turned deadly. At first, Nero tolerated her interference, though resentment simmered beneath his smiles. But by 59 CE, the tension had reached a breaking point. The young emperor resolved that Agrippina must die. Ancient writers record the drama with grim detail, how Nero plotted her death through poison, through collapsing ceilings, through ingenious contraptions of destruction. Each attempt failed, until finally he resorted to brutal simplicity. A boat, designed to sink as she sailed upon it, collapsed beneath her. She survived, swimming to shore. Soldiers were dispatched, blades in hand, to finish what the sea had not. Her cries, her pleas, her very motherhood could not sway them. And so, Agrippina the Younger, mother of the emperor, died at her son's command, her body left dishonored, her spirit wandering the shadows of Roman memory. With his mother gone, restraint slipped further away. Seneca's counsel grew weaker in Nero's ears. Burrus soon passed from life, and the emperor's indulgence in art and spectacle deepened. He fancied himself not merely ruler, but performer. The stage became his throne, the lyre his scepter. He sang, he acted, he played, demanding not only polite applause, but rapturous adoration. Senators, soldiers, and common citizens alike were compelled to watch, forced to cheer, their discomfort hidden behind masks of admiration. For in Rome, when the emperor desired to be artist, all must become his audience. Then came the fire. It was the year 64 CE, a hot summer when the Tiber's breezes brought no relief, when Rome's narrow streets, crowded with wooden tenements and bustling markets, stood tinder dry. One night, flames sparked in the Circus Maximus, where stalls of flammable goods lined the walls. The fire leapt quickly, driven by wind, racing across the city with a hunger that seemed unquenchable. For 6 days it raged, devouring temples, forums, homes, and shops. Families fled into the countryside, their possessions lost, their memories turned to ash. The roar of collapsing roofs mingled with the cries of the homeless, as the empire's proud heart became a landscape of ruin. In the aftermath, whispers began. Where had Nero been as Rome burned? Ancient sources, ever hostile, accused him of watching the flames from his palace, strumming his lyre, singing of the fall of Troy. Whether this tale was truth or slander, it clung to his memory, staining his name forever. What is certain is that Nero seized upon the destruction as opportunity. On the ashes of the old city, he envisioned a new Rome, one that reflected his grandeur. From the ruins rose the Domus Aurea, the Golden House, a sprawling palace of unimaginable opulence, with halls sheathed in gold leaf, ceilings that rotated like the heavens, and gardens that stretched like countryside within city walls. To build such a wonder, land was seized, resources drained, and citizens displaced. The people, who had once believed in his promise, now murmured of tyranny, of a ruler who placed his pleasure above their suffering. Yet even ruin required a scapegoat, and Nero found one in the Christians, a small and still obscure sect within the empire. Their refusal to worship Rome's gods, their secret gatherings, and their strange rituals made them easy targets. Nero declared them responsible for the fire, and the persecution began. In the gardens of his golden house, Christians were crucified, torn by wild beasts, or burned as living torches to light imperial feasts. The cruelty shocked even hardened Romans, though fear silenced most tongues. For the Christians, it became a trial of fire, their suffering a foundation upon which their faith would grow unshaken. As the years passed, Nero's extravagance deepened, his paranoia sharpened. He ordered the deaths of rivals, of generals, of senators who dared question him. His wife Octavia, beloved by the people, was cast aside and later executed. He married Poppaea Sabina, whose beauty and ambition matched his own vanity. Yet even she could not soften his dissent. When she quarrelled with him while pregnant, he struck her in rage, and she died, her unborn child lost with her. Nero wept, but his sorrow seemed drowned quickly in further indulgence, further cruelty. Beyond Rome the empire trembled. Revolts broke out in distant provinces. In Britain, Queen Boudicca rose in fury against Roman rule, her warriors laying waste to cities before being crushed. In Judea, unrest simmered. In Gaul and Spain, discontent grew. Nero, more enthralled by performance than by governance, offered little guidance. He toured Greece, competing in games, singing before audiences compelled to cheer, basking in a glory that seemed more illusion than power. The empire, vast and restless, felt the weight of neglect. By 68 CE, patience had run out. In Gaul, the governor Vindex raised the banner of rebellion, calling upon others to resist Nero's rule. The Senate, once cowed and silent, stirred at last. When the Praetorian Guard, guardians of the emperor, abandoned him for promises of reward from rival claimants, Nero found himself alone. His golden palace, his theatres, his visions of grandeur all crumbled in the face of betrayal. Fleeing the city, he sought refuge, wandering with only a handful of attendants. At last, cornered, he faced the end. Too afraid to take his own life, he begged his secretary Epaphroditus to aid him. With trembling hands the deed was done. Nero, last of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, died in the 6th of June 8 CE, his final words whispered with despair, "Qualis artifex perio, what an artist dies in me." The news spread quickly. Rome breathed with mingled relief and uncertainty. The Senate declared him a public enemy, erasing his name from inscriptions, his memory condemned to oblivion in a practice known as damnatio memoriae. Yet memory is stubborn, and Nero's image, whether in hatred or fascination, lingered. For some in the provinces, especially in the east, rumours arose that he still lived, that he would return to reclaim his throne. Such was the impression he left. A ruler so theatrical in life that even death seemed uncertain, his shadow stretching long beyond the grave. The city he left behind bore his scars. The golden house, incomplete yet magnificent, stood as a symbol of excess amid a people still rebuilding homes. The Christians, though broken and bloodied, carried with them stories of martyrdom that would echo into eternity. And the empire, deprived of its master, entered a year of chaos and civil war as generals and governors vied for the throne, their legions clashing in what became known as the Year of the Four Emperors. Nero's death had not brought peace. It had brought turmoil, the empire shaken at its very core. And so, as the centuries passed, the tale of Nero became legend. To some, he was the embodiment of tyranny, a ruler whose vanity and cruelty consumed an empire's heart. To others, he was a cautionary tale, a reminder that power without wisdom, indulgence without restraint, leads only to ruin. The flames of Rome, whether or not lit by his hand, became bound to his name forever. And in the quiet rhythm of history, his reign remains a shadowed melody, one that drifts gently across time like smoke upon the summer air. King John of England, 1199-1216. The year was 1199, and the throne of England passed into uneasy hands. Richard the Lionheart, warrior, king and crusader, had died from an arrow wound in France. His younger brother John, long overshadowed, ascended to the crown. To many, It seemed an unexpected twist of fate, for John had never been destined for greatness. As the youngest son of King Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine, he had once been nicknamed Lackland, for no inheritance seemed reserved for him. Yet through the accidents of fortune and the deaths of elder brothers, the crown now circled his brow. England, bruised from wars abroad and restless under the burdens of taxation, now belonged to a man whose reputation for cunning already cast long shadows. At first glance, John was no monster. He was intelligent, even shrewd, with a sharp memory and a mind for detail. He spoke languages, understood law, and moved with a certain practical skill through the machinery of governance. Yet beneath these gifts lay weaknesses that would doom his reign: suspicion, cruelty, and a temper quick to flame. Where Richard had embodied bold courage and chivalry, John seemed marked by mistrust and insecurity. And in the medieval world, where kings were expected to embody strength and honour, these failings would prove disastrous. Almost immediately, his position as king was tested. Across the Channel, in the rich lands of Normandy, Anjou, and Aquitaine, the barons of France questioned his right to rule. King Philip II of France, ever eager to expand his power, seized the moment to challenge John's authority. Battles flared, castles shifted allegiance, and John, lacking the charisma of his brother, struggled to inspire loyalty. In 1200, he secured a temporary peace by ceding territory and marrying Isabella of Angoulême, a young noblewoman whose beauty dazzled but whose betrothal to another had already been promised. In breaking that engagement, John ignited feuds that would haunt his reign. The worst came in 1202, when Arthur of Brittany, John's teenage nephew and legitimate rival for the throne, fell into his hands. Chroniclers tell a grim tale that John, suspicious of Arthur's popularity and fearing rebellion, ordered his nephew's death. Some wrote that he stabbed the boy himself, others that he consigned him to the dungeons of Rouen, never to be seen again. Whether murder or quiet disappearance, Arthur's fate stained John's name, turning subjects against him and giving Philip of France a cause to rally. By 1204, Normandy was lost. For centuries, English kings had ruled this land across the Channel, their identity bound to both England and France. But John, through weakness, mistrust, and mismanagement, allowed it to slip away. The nobles of Normandy swore fealty to Philip, and the great duchy, once the jewel of the Plantagenet Empire, was absorbed into the French crown. English lords who held lands in France now faced ruin, their loyalty shaken, their trust in John fading like mist at dawn. At home, John's rule grew heavier. To finance his wars and recover lost lands, he taxed relentlessly. Fines, scutages, and arbitrary fees fell upon nobles and commoners alike. Merchants grumbled, peasants strained, and barons, proud and warlike, fumed at the king's endless demands. Justice, too, seemed for sale, as John twisted law for his profit, extracting bribes for verdicts or pardons. In an age when kings were seen as the guardians of fairness, this corruption cut deeply. His temper, sharp and cruel, alienated even his closest allies. Chroniclers recorded tales of his fits of rage, of punishments inflicted with merciless severity. Nobles who crossed him were starved in dungeons, their wives and children held as hostages. One story tells of Matilda de Braose, whose husband offended the king. When debts were not paid swiftly, John ordered Matilda and her son imprisoned, where they were left to die of hunger. Such acts, remembered in whispers, spread fear but not respect, for fear without trust is a fragile thing, and in time it turns to rebellion. In 1209, John quarrelled with the church. When the Archbishop of Canterbury died, the monks of Canterbury and Pope Innocent III each put forward different candidates for the position. John rejected both, seeking to impose his own choice. The Pope responded by consecrating Stephen Langton, a learned man but one John despised. Enraged, John refused him entry into England. Thus began an interdict. The Church, by papal order, suspended all services across the land. Bells fell silent, marriages went unblessed, The dead were buried without rites. The people murmured, for in the medieval mind, to live without the sacraments was to dwell in spiritual peril. John, excommunicated, stood alone, his legitimacy eroded by both heaven and earth. By 1213, faced with the threat of French invasion and isolation from the Church, John submitted. He surrendered England as a papal fief, paying tribute to Rome and recognizing Innocent as his overlord. To some, it was an act of pragmatism, buying papal support against France. To others, it was humiliation, the surrender of England's independence to foreign hands. Either way, John's reputation sank lower, his authority mocked. The great crisis of his reign arrived in 1214. Desperate to reclaim his French lands, John assembled a vast army and marched once more across the Channel. At the Battle of Bouvines, his allies faced Philip of France. The battle ended in disaster. John's coalition collapsed, his troops fled, and Philip stood triumphant. Normandy was lost forever, and with it, John's dreams of empire. Returning to England, empty-handed and burdened by debts, he found his barons simmering with fury. By 1215, rebellion erupted. The barons, weary of his taxes, his injustice, and his failures, rose in arms. London, heart of the realm, opened its gates to them. John, cornered and desperate, met his lords at Runnymede in June. There, beside the Thames, he sealed a parchment that would echo through the ages, the Magna Carta. Its clauses bound the king to law, promising that justice would not be sold, delayed, or denied, that taxation required the consent of his council, that no free man would be imprisoned, save by judgment of his peers. Though intended as a peace treaty, the Magna Carta was revolutionary. It declared that kings themselves were not above the law, a seed that would grow into the principles of liberty centuries later. Yet for John, it was humiliation. He sealed it reluctantly, intending to break it at the first opportunity. Within weeks, he appealed to the Pope, who annulled the charter, declaring it void. War flared once again, barons against king, England divided. John's final years were marked by desperation and decline. As rebellion raged, he marched tirelessly across the land, besieging castles, punishing towns, and seeking to crush resistance. In 1216, while campaigning in the east, he crossed the Wash, a dangerous tidal estuary. Caught by the tides, much of his baggage train was lost treasures, regalia, and supplies swallowed by the sea. Soon after, illness struck. Fevered and weakened, John retreated to Newark Castle. There, in October 1216, he died, not yet 50 years old, leaving his 9-year-old son Henry to inherit a kingdom in chaos. John's reign, brief but catastrophic, became legend. Chroniclers painted him as the worst of kings, cowardly, cruel, treacherous, and faithless. Whether wholly deserved or sharpened by hostile monks and barons, his legacy remains. The Magna Carta, forced from his reluctant hand, became the foundation of liberties not only in England, but across the world. Ironically, the man remembered as England's worst king gave rise to one of its greatest achievements. And so, in the calm procession of history, King John drifts as a figure of warning. His suspicion, his cruelty, his failures in war, his quarrels with church and nobles all became a lesson in how power, if abused, unravels itself. From his shadow, the idea of law above kings began to shine, and though he left his kingdom weakened, the echoes of his reign shaped centuries to come, a paradox of ruin that gave birth to freedom. Charles VI of France, 1380–1422. The year was 1380, and France lay exhausted. The 100 Years' War with England, sparked decades earlier in 1337, had already drained men, money, and hope. King Charles V, known as the Wise, died that year, leaving behind a realm fragile but recovering, and a son barely 12 years old. That son, Charles VI, stepped onto the throne as a boy king, his reign beginning not with triumph but with the weight of expectation. Few could have foreseen how his life would unfold, a tale not of strength but of tragedy, madness, and a kingdom torn by civil war. In those first years, government rested in the hands of regents. Charles's uncles, the Dukes of Burgundy, Anjou, Berry and Bourbon, each claimed power. They were men of ambition and appetite, eager to exploit their nephew's youth. France, already burdened by taxes from long wars, now suffered under the greed of these magnates. Revenues vanished into private coffers, corruption spread, and discontent simmered in towns and villages alike. It was in these years of regency that the seeds of division were sown, seeds that would later fracture the kingdom. At 14, Charles was declared of age. For a brief moment, the kingdom breathed easier. The boy king seemed promising, tall, handsome, energetic, eager to restore dignity to the crown. He threw off his uncle's control, reinstated his father's trusted advisors, the so-called marmosets, and began to govern with diligence. Taxes were reduced, justice improved, and hope flickered again. People whispered that Charles might grow into his father's wisdom, perhaps even rescue France from its long decline. But fate is cruel. In 1392, when Charles was 24, an event occurred that would alter his life forever. A plot had been discovered against one of his close friends, and the king, enraged, insisted on leading an army to punish the culprit in Brittany. It was a sweltering summer, and as the royal retinue rode through a forest near Le Mans, a strange incident unfolded. A barefoot man dressed in rags suddenly rushed forward, seizing the king's horse and crying out that betrayal and ruin lay ahead. The man was beaten aside, but his words unsettled the company. Moments later, as they rode onward, a page accidentally dropped a lance with a clatter. At that sharp sound, Charles gave a terrible scream, drew his sword, and turned upon his own men. What followed was madness. In a frenzy, the king struck down several knights, killing at least 4 before he could be restrained. When the fit passed, he collapsed, exhausted, unable to recall what he had done. From that day, Charles's mind never fully returned. At intervals, he descended into madness, raving, hallucinating, unable to recognize his wife or children, wandering the halls of his palaces in confusion. Chroniclers tell of times when he believed himself made of glass, so fragile that he refused to be touched for fear of shattering. On other occasions, he ran through the corridors howling like a beast, or sat immobile for hours, lost in silence. These episodes could last months. At times, lucidity returned, and Charles governed with a measure of reason. But more often, he was incapacitated, and the kingdom fell into the hands of regents once again. This instability became the curse of his reign. For France, locked in a bitter struggle with England, needed strong leadership. Instead, it endured a king whose mind faltered, leaving a vacuum eagerly filled by ambitious princes. Foremost among them was the king's uncle, Philip the Bold, Duke of Burgundy. Clever and calculating, Philip expanded his influence, controlling policy and wealth. After his death, his son John the Fearless inherited Burgundy's ambitions. On the other side stood Louis, Duke of Orleans, Charles VI's brother. Passionate, reckless, and hungry for power, Louis sought control of the crown during the king's absences of reason. Between these two princes, Burgundy and Orleans France fractured into factions, their rivalry plunging the kingdom into civil war. The people suffered most. Taxes rose to feed the ambitions of both parties, while lawlessness spread in the countryside. Towns fell to one side or the other, and soldiers plundered without mercy. For peasants, already scarred by the memory of the plague that had swept Europe a generation earlier, these years of chaos deepened despair. In Paris, riots erupted, bread prices soared, and the poor howled against corruption. The kingdom, once guided by Charles V's wisdom, now seemed adrift in stormy seas, its rudder shattered. In 1407, the conflict turned bloody. John the Fearless arranged the assassination of Louis of Orleans on a cold November evening. As Louis rode home, he was set upon by hired killers, his skull split open with axes. The murder shocked France, but John, far from denying it, openly admitted his deed, claiming it was for the good of the kingdom to rid France of a tyrant. His words split the nobility further. Some sided with Burgundy, others with the Orléans family, who became known as the Armagnacs. From then onward, France was consumed by civil war between Burgundians and Armagnacs, fought under the shadow of a king too broken to rule. Meanwhile, England watched. The long war between the two kingdoms had quieted in the late 14th century, but the turmoil in France offered opportunity. In 1415, King Henry V of England launched a fresh invasion, claiming his right to the French crown. He landed at Harfleur, captured the port, and marched across Normandy. The French, though numerous, were divided by their civil strife. When armies met at Agincourt in October, the French nobility, armoured and proud, charged recklessly across muddy fields. The English longbowmen cut them down by the thousands. France's chivalry lay broken, and Henry V emerged triumphant, his path into northern France wide open. Charles VI, by then lost in madness, could not respond. His queen, Isabeau of Bavaria, weary of chaos, sought to preserve her own position. She allied with Burgundy, and in 1420 the Treaty of Troyes was signed. This treaty disinherited Charles's son, the Dauphin, declaring instead that Henry V of England would inherit the French crown upon Charles's death. For the Kingdom of France, it was the ultimate humiliation. Their king's madness had left them vulnerable. Their queen had surrendered their sovereignty, and their enemy now stood poised to rule them. Yet history twists in unexpected ways. In 1422, Henry V died suddenly, only months before Charles himself passed away. The English crown passed to Henry's infant son, while Charles's son, the Dauphin, declared himself King Charles VII. The war dragged on, fueled by Joan of Arc's arrival years later, until France slowly reclaimed its strength. But for Charles VI, remembered by his people as Charles the Mad, the story was one of decline. His reign had stretched over 40 years, and yet it was a reign marked less by his own deeds than by his absence of reason. His madness became legend. Chroniclers wrote of the King of Glass, fragile in mind and body, a tragic figure whose illness mirrored the fragility of his realm. France under his rule endured famine, civil war, assassination, and foreign conquest. Where a wise and steady king might have resisted England, Charles's broken mind left the kingdom vulnerable. His tragedy, deeply personal, became a national disaster. And so, in the long line of Europe's kings, Charles VI stands as a warning. Not all ruin comes from cruelty or malice. Sometimes, ruin comes from weakness, from illness, from fate itself turning against a monarch. His life, stretching from the hopeful days of his youth in the 1382nd to the bitter twilight of the 1422nd, charts the fall of France into chaos. His reign reminds us how fragile the bond between crown and kingdom can be, how the madness of one man can unravel the fabric of a nation. Ivan IV, the Terrible of Russia, 1547-1584. The year was 1530 when a child was born in the fortified Kremlin of Moscow, a boy who would one day be remembered with fear across Europe and Asia. His name was Ivan, son of Vasily III, Grand Prince of Moscow, and Elena Glinskaya, his strong-willed second wife. His birth came at a time when the state of Muscovy was consolidating power, rising from the ashes of Mongol domination, yet still vulnerable to its fractious nobles, the boyars, who coveted influence. By the time Ivan was just 3 years old, his father was dead, and his mother became regent. She tried to hold the throne for her son, but in 1538 she too died, possibly poisoned by rivals. Thus, Ivan entered childhood as an orphan, his throne surrounded by wolves. The years that followed scarred him deeply. The boyars treated the young heir with contempt, seizing power and wealth, while the child prince was neglected. He recalled later how he was often left hungry, dressed in rags, ignored by servants who mocked him, and sometimes beaten. In those cold, lonely chambers of the Kremlin, Ivan learned bitterness. Yet he also learned to read. absorbing scripture and chronicles, imagining himself as God's chosen ruler, destined to crush the arrogance of the nobility. This childhood of neglect and humiliation became the seed of his future ruthlessness. In 1547, at the age of 17, Ivan was crowned in Moscow. He was not merely declared Grand Prince, as rulers before him had been, but took the title of Tsar, a word derived from Caesar, meant to emphasize his role as emperor and autocrat. It was the first time the title was formally assumed in Russia, and the symbolism was immense. Ivan claimed divine right, presenting himself not as first among equals, but as absolute ruler ordained by God. The bells of Moscow rang as he processed through the Kremlin, wearing robes and a crown that proclaimed a new era. At first, there was promise. Ivan married Anastasia Romanovna, a woman from a respected but not overbearing noble family. With her calming influence, his early reign was marked by reforms. He convened a council known as the Zemsky Sobor, bringing together clergy, nobles, and townsmen. He introduced a new legal code, the Sudebnik of 1550, which sought to reduce corruption and impose order on local governance. He founded the Streltsy, a standing military corps of musketeers, ensuring loyalty to the crown rather than the fickle boyars. He even encouraged printing, establishing Russia's first printing press. For a time, people hoped Ivan would become a wise and just ruler, shedding the shadows of his childhood. But Russia's vast lands demanded more than reform, they demanded conquest. Ivan cast his gaze eastward, toward the Tatar Khanates that had once dominated Russia under the Mongol yoke. In 1552, he launched a campaign against Kazan, capital of a powerful Tatar state. The siege was long and bloody, but Ivan's forces, armed with artillery and determination, eventually stormed the city. The victory was decisive. Kazan fell, its Khanate absorbed into Muscovy. A few years later, in 1556, Astrakhan also fell, bringing the lower Volga under Ivan's control. For the first time, Russia stretched to the Caspian Sea, and Ivan proclaimed himself ruler of a growing empire. To mark this triumph, he commissioned the building of St. Basil's Cathedral in Moscow, its colourful onion domes rising like flames into the sky, a symbol of faith and power, still iconic today. Yet conquest came at a price. Expansion to the east was relatively secure, but Ivan also hungered for influence in the west. He sought access to the Baltic Sea, launching the Livonian War in 1558. At first, his armies surged forward, overwhelming the Livonian order and seizing fortresses. But the war dragged on for decades, drawing in Poland, Lithuania, and Sweden. It became a grinding conflict that drained resources, devastated towns, and left the people weary. By its end, Ivan had little to show for his efforts, save for a weakened state and enemies pressing on all sides. The turning point of his reign came not in war, but in his private life. In 1560, Anastasia, his beloved wife, died suddenly. Ivan was devastated, convinced that she had been poisoned by the boyars. Whether this was true remains uncertain, but Ivan's paranoia deepened. He withdrew from court, suspecting plots everywhere, his grief curdling into rage. From this point forward, his reign shifted from stern autocracy to terror. In 1565, Ivan announced the creation of the Oprichnina, a separate domain within Russia ruled directly by him, divided from the rest of the state. To enforce it, he raised a corps of enforcers, the Oprichniki, clad in black and mounted on horses, adorned with severed dogs' heads and brooms, symbols of their mission to sniff out treason and sweep away enemies. These men became instruments of fear. Towns suspected of disloyalty were plundered, nobles who defied Ivan were executed, and thousands were tortured or exiled. The most infamous episode came in 1570, when Ivan turned his fury upon the city of Novgorod. Convinced the city was conspiring with Lithuania, he ordered a purge, For weeks, the Oprichniki terrorized its people, burning, looting, and killing. Men, women, and children alike were tortured and drowned in the frozen Volkhov River. The once proud city, center of trade and culture, was left shattered. Ivan's message was clear. Loyalty must be absolute. Dissent would be annihilated. Ivan's cruelty spared no one, not even his own family. In 1581, during a violent quarrel, he struck his eldest son and heir, Ivan Ivanovich, with a staff, fatally wounding him. The image of the Tsar cradling his dying son, overcome with horror at what he had done, became one of the most haunting symbols of his reign, later immortalized in painting. With that act, he destroyed his own dynasty's strength. His surviving son, Fyodor, was weak and incapable of effective rule, ensuring that instability would follow Ivan's death. By the time Ivan died in 1584, playing a game of chess in the Kremlin, Russia was a land transformed. His conquests had expanded the state into a multi-ethnic empire, stretching across vast steppes and rivers. He had laid foundations for centralized autocracy, crushing noble power. Yet he had also left behind scars, a devastated economy, a traumatized population, and a succession crisis that would plunge Russia into the time of troubles. His title, the Terrible, captured the duality of his reign. In Russian, Grozny carried a sense of awe-inspiring. Formidable might not merely monstrous cruelty, but fearsome power. To his subjects, he was both ruler and tyrant, protector and destroyer. Historians still debate Ivan's legacy. Was he the architect of Russia's transformation into an empire, or the destroyer who plunged it into chaos? Perhaps he was both. What is certain is that his reign, spanning from 1547 to 1584, remains one of the most dramatic in medieval history. The boy who had suffered neglect and humiliation became a man who inflicted terror to secure loyalty. His paranoia, his cruelty, and his restless ambition reshaped Russia for centuries to come. For the listener drifting into rest, the tale of Ivan IV serves as a reminder of how personal tragedy can warp into national catastrophe. His reign is a story of contrasts, reform and repression, glory and horror, triumph and tragedy. In his life, the fragile thread between order and chaos was stretched until it snapped, leaving behind an empire scarred, yet indelibly altered. Christian II of Denmark, 1513–1523. In the early 16th century, Northern Europe was a region of shifting allegiances, fragile unions, and dynastic ambitions. Amid this turmoil, a young prince named Christian ascended to the throne of Denmark, Norway, and, for a brief time, Sweden. Born in 1481, the son of King Hans of Denmark, Christian grew up in a court that prized cunning and pragmatism. His father had spent much of his reign attempting to strengthen the Kalmar Union, the political alliance that bound Denmark, Norway, and Sweden under a single crown. It was a union strained by competing interests, for Sweden jealously guarded its autonomy and resented the dominance of Denmark. From the beginning, Christian inherited a throne weighted with the expectations of kingship and the suspicions of his subjects. When Christian II became king in 1513, his coronation was greeted with unease. Denmark itself was not fully stable, with nobles eager to limit royal authority, but the far greater challenge lay across the sea in Sweden. There, the nobility and clergy resisted Danish rule, determined to assert their independence. Christian, ambitious and determined, resolved to subdue them and bring Sweden firmly under his control. He believed that only through force could the union be preserved. Yet he also believed himself enlightened, willing to reform society, favouring the rights of commoners and townsmen over the entrenched privileges of aristocracy. This blend of authoritarian ambition and social reform would define his reign and ultimately lead to his downfall. Christian's marriage reflected both political calculation and personal entanglement. In 1515, he wed Isabella of Austria, a niece of the mighty Emperor Charles V. The match tied Denmark to the Habsburg dynasty, one of the most powerful families in Europe. Yet Christian's affections lay elsewhere. For years he had maintained a relationship with Dyveke Sigbritsdatter, a Dutch commoner whose mother, Sigbrit, became one of his closest advisors. This scandalized the nobility, for they despised the influence of a foreign woman of low birth at court. Sigbrit, clever and ambitious, encouraged Christian's reforms, pushing him to challenge aristocratic power. Thus, the seeds of conflict between king and nobility deepened. The defining event of Christian's reign came in Sweden. In 1520, he launched a military campaign to force the Swedish into obedience. His forces, after fierce fighting, captured Stockholm. That November, he was crowned King of Sweden, seemingly fulfilling the dream of uniting the North. But triumph quickly turned to horror. After the coronation festivities, Christian ordered a purge of his opponents, accusing them of heresy and treason. Over the course of several days, between 80 and 100 leading nobles, clergy, and citizens were executed in what became known as the Stockholm bloodbath. The executions were brutal, carried out in public squares before the eyes of horrified onlookers. Heads rolled, bodies were displayed, and the city's mood shifted from celebration to terror. Christian believed he was securing order by eliminating rebellion. Instead, he guaranteed hatred. The massacre united Sweden against him. Within a few years, Swedish rebels rallied under the leadership of Gustav Vasa, driving out Danish forces and declaring independence. The Kalmar Union was shattered forever. Back in Denmark, Christian's reputation collapsed. His reliance on advisors like Sigbrit alienated the nobility, who viewed him as a tyrant undermining their privileges. His reforms, such as protecting the rights of peasants against abuse, imposing stricter laws on landlords, and supporting townsmen in trade disputes, might have improved life for common people, but they enraged the elite. The Stockholm bloodbath provided the perfect justification to brand him as unfit to rule. By 1523, the nobility rose in rebellion. Christian, abandoned by many allies, fled Denmark with his family. His uncle, Frederick I, seized the throne, welcomed by nobles eager to restore their authority. For Christian, exile was the beginning of a long decline. He sought aid from his powerful Habsburg relatives, appealing to Emperor Charles V, but the emperor, wary of entanglements in Scandinavia, offered little help. In 1531, Christian attempted a comeback. With a fleet and troops, he sailed back to Norway, hoping to reclaim his crown. At first he was welcomed in Oslo, but his support quickly crumbled. In 1532, he surrendered under promise of safe conduct. Instead of being restored, he was betrayed, captured and imprisoned. He would spend the rest of his life 27 long years in confinement. His prison was not a dungeon but a castle, Sønderborg on the island of Ulls. Yet his conditions were harsh. For the first 17 years, he was kept in a small chamber, with meagre furnishings, limited company, and guarded day and night. Legends tell of him pacing endlessly in circles around a stone pillar, wearing grooves into the floor. Whether this detail is fact or myth, it conveys the image of a king reduced to monotony and despair. Only in his later years was he granted slightly more freedom, moved to Kalundborg Castle, where he could walk in the gardens. But by then, his health and spirit had been broken. In 1559, he died at the age of 77, a once ambitious monarch who had spent nearly half his life in captivity. The legacy of Christian II is one of contradiction. To the common people of Denmark, Norway, and the Netherlands, he was remembered with some affection, for he had tried to curb noble excesses and protect the weak. Ballads and folklore celebrated him as a friend of the poor, unjustly cast down by greedy lords. To the nobility and to Sweden, he was remembered as a tyrant, a blood-stained butcher who had tried to impose his will through terror. His reign illustrates the fragile balance between reform and repression, ambition and cruelty. The time frame of his reign, 1513 to 1523, may seem short compared to other monarchs, but its consequences echoed for centuries. The Stockholm bloodbath ensured Swedish independence, shaping the future of Northern Europe. His fall underscored the power of the nobility to shape monarchs' fates, and his long imprisonment serves as one of history's stark reminders of how quickly fortune can turn against kings who overreach. For the listener drifting into calm reflection, Christian's story is both tragic and cautionary. He sought to be a reformer, but bloodshed destroyed his vision. He dreamed of uniting kingdoms, but his cruelty tore them apart. His life, ending in silence behind castle walls, invites meditation on power's fleeting nature. A king may rise with ambition and fall with equal speed, leaving behind not triumph, but cautionary tales whispered through time. Charles VI of France, 1380–1422. The story drifts gently now toward the late 14th century, into the halls of France where the banners of lilies hung heavy and the bells of Paris tolled over a kingdom troubled by war, famine, and uneasy truce. Here sat Charles VI, a boy of only 11 years when he inherited the crown in 1380 after the death of his father. Charles V, a ruler remembered for wisdom and order. The young Charles was crowned in the Gothic magnificence of Rheims Cathedral, a place where kings were believed to be touched with divine grace, and at first the people of France allowed themselves to hope. He was called Charles the Beloved, and for a brief moment his reign seemed blessed with unity. But the years would not be kind, and the bright promise of his youth would sink into shadows of illness, madness, and calamity that would haunt France for generations. The court in Paris glittered at first, filled with pageantry, knights in polished armour, and noble women in gowns of brilliant silks imported from Italy and Byzantium. Yet behind the embroidered curtains of the great halls lurked division. Because the king was so young, his uncles ruled as regents, and they were not content merely to protect their nephew's crown. The Dukes of Burgundy, Anjou, and Berry vied with each other for influence, feathering their nests with taxes taken from peasants already worn thin by years of war with England. The 100 Years' War, stretching across decades, left towns in ashes and fields barren. Into this atmosphere of strained hope, Charles grew into manhood. When Charles came of age at 20, the people celebrated his decision to dismiss his greedy uncles and place trusted advisors in power. For a while, prosperity flickered back into view. Markets in Paris thrived, and Charles married Isabeau of Bavaria, whose beauty and lavish courtly style dazzled observers. The couple rode together in splendid processions through the cobbled streets, the young king's golden hair catching the sun, and songs praising him rang from the throats of troubadours. But in 1392, when Charles was only 24, fate turned cruelly against him. The incident came in the heat of summer, while Charles led a campaign against a traitorous noble. Riding through the forests of Le Mans, a sudden noise startled him, perhaps a clanging of arms, perhaps the gleam of steel. In a frenzy, Charles drew his sword and turned not upon the enemy, but upon his own men. Madness, sudden and ungovernable, seized him. He attacked his loyal knights, striking wildly until he had slain 4 of them, and could only be restrained with great difficulty. When he awoke from his frenzy, he seemed unaware of what he had done, bewildered like a child waking from a nightmare. This was the beginning of his long descent. Episodes of insanity plagued him, coming unpredictably and leaving courtiers trembling with fear. At times he refused to bathe or change his clothes for months, convinced he was made of glass and that a touch might shatter him. He ordered iron rods sewn into his garments to protect this fragile body, he imagined. On other days he wandered the corridors of the palace without recognizing his queen or his children, speaking to them as strangers. Once, when courtiers tried to calm him, he screamed that he was not their king at all, but some nameless creature trapped in a body that was crumbling away. Physicians of the age, with little knowledge of mental illness, prescribed bleeding, potions of herbs, and pilgrimages to holy shrines. None brought lasting relief. As the king drifted in and out of madness, governance slipped from his hands. His uncles returned to power, quarrelling bitterly with the queen and with each other, and the kingdom fell into chaos. taxes rose again, while peasants groaned under the burden of feeding armies that could not protect them. The English, ever watchful across the Channel, pressed their advantage, raiding Norman towns and pushing deeper into French lands. The unity Charles had once inspired dissolved into rival factions, with the Dukes of Burgundy and Orleans vying for dominance, their private feud growing into open bloodshed in the streets of Paris. Isabeau of Bavaria, left to manage the court, soon found herself accused of extravagance and corruption. Gossip swirled through the taverns that she took lovers among courtiers and squandered the treasury on jewels and feasts. Whether true or not, these rumours further weakened the crown. To the common people, the queen seemed distant, the king unreachable, and the nobles greedy. France bled, while its ruler, once the beloved, became Charles the Mad. Chroniclers wrote of him with sorrow, describing how the light of reason would flicker in his eyes only to vanish again, leaving him lost in a fog of delusion. The court tried again and again to bring stability. In 1396, a peace was briefly achieved with England through the marriage of Charles's daughter Isabella to Richard II of England, though the girl was only 6 years old at the time. But the peace faltered, and when Richard himself was deposed a few years later, the fragile truce collapsed. France was once again pulled into the whirlpool of war. Charles, unable to rule, was often locked away during his fits. At times he raved violently, attacking his own servants, while at others he sat for hours in silence, refusing to speak or eat. To those who served him, it seemed the king they once knew had been stolen by invisible forces. By 1407, the feud between the Dukes of Burgundy and Orleans erupted in a brutal murder. Louis of Orleans, the king's brother, was hacked down in the streets of Paris on the orders of John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy. The killing shocked the realm, and civil war followed, dividing the kingdom into Armagnacs and Burgundians. With the king incapacitated, France became a battlefield not only against England but against itself. The people, desperate for leadership, looked to saints and prophets, but none could still the chaos. In 1415, the disaster of Agincourt struck. The English, under Henry V, crushed the French nobility with terrifying efficiency, their longbows cutting down knights in armour like wheat before the scythe. Thousands of Frenchmen perished in the mud, their banners trampled into the blood-soaked fields. Charles, incapable of leading his armies, could only watch as his kingdom slipped further into ruin. Chroniclers described him during this time as pale and gaunt, his once bright hair now grey, his eyes clouded with confusion. At moments he seemed to grasp the catastrophe that had befallen his realm, weeping uncontrollably. At others he seemed oblivious, lost in his belief that he was made of glass. The final humiliation came in 1420 with the Treaty of Troyes. In this fateful agreement, Isabeau and the Burgundian faction recognised Henry V of England as heir to the French throne, disinheriting Charles's own son, the Dauphin Charles. Many Frenchmen regarded this as treason, but with their king incapable and their queen compromised, they could do little. When Charles VI died 2 years later, in 1422, the kingdom he left behind was fractured, much of it under English control, and his own son forced into exile. It would be years before Joan of Arc would rally the French under the banner of the Dauphin and turn the tide of war. Charles VI's reign stands as one of the most tragic in French history. His madness, beyond his control, became the downfall of his kingdom. Chroniclers pitied him, describing how a man once beloved became a shadow of himself, haunted by visions no one else could see. To the people of France, he was both victim and curse a king whose broken mind broke the nation. His story reminds us how fragile leadership can be when bound to the mortal frailties of a single human being, and how, in a medieval world without understanding of illness, madness was seen as both divine punishment and an omen of doom. And so, in the stillness of night, the tale of Charles VI lingers, a boy crowned with hope, a young man called beloved, and an older king remembered only as mad. The rise and fall of his mind mirrored the rise and fall of his kingdom until both were left in pieces, waiting for salvation that would come only long after his final breath. The bells of Paris tolled for him, not with triumph, but with sorrow. Richard II of England, 1377-1399, a king undone by vanity and distrust. Richard II came to the throne as a boy of only 10 years old in the year 1377, following the long and mighty reign of his grandfather Edward III. The boy king was crowned in Westminster Abbey with all the trappings of ceremony, his small figure draped in regal robes too heavy for his thin shoulders, his crown almost slipping on his head as he bowed before the altar. In those early years, the people looked on him with hope. He was, after all, the child who would lead England after a glorious age of victories in the 100 Years' War, the boy whose destiny seemed tied to God's favour. Yet as time passed, that fragile boy grew into a man marked not by steady wisdom or strong leadership, but by vanity, extravagance, and distrust that eroded his kingdom's stability. What began in the glow of promise would, by the end of his reign in 1399, end in humiliation, deposition, and a lonely death in captivity. The world into which Richard stepped as a boy king was already trembling. His grandfather's later years had been clouded by decline. His father, the valiant Black Prince, was dead before him, and the people bore heavy burdens of taxation from the war with France. Within just 4 years of his reign, in 1381, England would be rocked by the peasants' revolt. The uprising sprang from anger at harsh taxes, particularly the hated poll tax, and from the grinding poverty endured by peasants across the land. As the rebels surged toward London under the leadership of Wat Tyler, young Richard, only 14 at the time, faced his first test as king. The moment was both defining and deceiving. When he rode out to meet the rebels at Smithfield, his calm words and unexpected bravery seemed to charm fate itself. "I am your king," he declared. "Follow me." His presence quelled the rising fury, at least briefly, and historians have long remembered that day as one of courage. But beneath that early success, Richard's character was already forming in ways that would one day destroy him. He would become a king who believed more in divine right and personal majesty than in the hard work of compromise with lords and commons. Richard grew older into a ruler with grand tastes. He adored art, pageantry, and ceremony, surrounding himself with poets, musicians, and courtiers who indulged his sense of royal magnificence. He saw the kingship not as a balancing act between crown and nobility, but as a sacred office that raised him far above all others. In the late 1382 and early 1392, he began to fashion the court into something splendid, ordering tapestries, gilded halls, and extravagant feasts that dazzled visitors but drained the treasury. He was especially fond of symbols of his divine right, carrying the white hart emblem as his badge, dressing in magnificent robes embroidered with gold, and demanding elaborate shows of deference. In his mind, the king was not first among equals, but a figure almost untouchable, a living vessel of God's authority on earth. Yet this belief, so deeply cherished by Richard, collided violently with the expectations of the English nobility, who believed kings should rule with their counsel, not in defiance of it. Conflict soon came. In the late 1382, Richard clashed with a group of powerful nobles remembered as the Lords Appellant. These men, including the Duke of Gloucester and the Earls of Warwick and Arundel, feared the influence of Richard's close circle of favourites, whom they accused of corruption and of steering the king toward reckless policies. The tension grew sharp in 1387 and 1388, culminating in what historians call the Merciless Parliament. During that gathering, Richard was forced into submission, his favourites condemned, executed, or driven into exile, and his authority clipped. For a time, he lived under the shadow of these lords, his royal dignity battered. Yet Richard never forgot the humiliation. Deep within, the boy who once stood boldly before rebels now nurtured a cold seed of revenge. His vanity and pride could not bear the insult, and he would bide his time until he could reclaim power and strike back. That chance came in the early 1300s, 392, when Richard, now in his 20s, began to reassert himself. He reconciled with some enemies, rebuilt alliances, and slowly turned the machinery of crown power back into his own hands. In 1397, he struck. With calculated precision, he arrested the Lords Appellant who had once reduced him to near puppet. Gloucester, Warwick, and Arundel were seized, tried, and punished. Arundel was executed, Warwick exiled, and Gloucester, though imprisoned, died suspiciously, widely believed to have been murdered on Richard's orders. At last the king felt his majesty restored. He exulted in triumph, rewarding loyal followers and dispensing favours to his court of sycophants. Yet even in victory, his actions sowed new distrust. His harshness alarmed many who had once supported him, and his growing reliance on vengeance created a climate of fear around the throne. As the 1392 progressed, Richard's governance grew more erratic. He demanded extraordinary taxes for his schemes, including his expensive peace policies with France. In 1396, he arranged a marriage to Isabella of Valois, the young daughter of the French king, as part of a 28-year truce in the 100 Years' War. Though politically shrewd, the match was unsettling. Isabella was only 6 years old, and many in England distrusted peace with France, seeing it as dishonour after decades of fighting. Richard, however, revelled in the symbolism of being a king who could make peace through grandeur and alliance. He surrounded himself with flatterers who praised his magnificence, and he lavished money on his court while resentment grew outside the palace walls. Perhaps most destructive of all was his treatment of Henry Bolingbroke, cousin of Richard and son of John of Gaunt. At first, Richard and Henry had been allies, but mistrust widened the gap. In 1398, a quarrel between Henry and another noble, Thomas Mowbray, threatened to spill into open duel. Richard intervened by banishing both men, Henry for 10 years, Mowbray for life. When John of Gaunt died in 1399, Henry should have inherited his vast Lancastrian estates. Instead, Richard seized them for the crown. This act, seen as tyrannical and unjust, alienated not only Henry but also many nobles who feared their lands could be taken next. Richard had, in his vanity, cut off the branch on which his own kingship rested. In the summer of 1399, while Richard was away in Ireland, Henry Bolingbroke returned to England, gathering support as he claimed his inheritance. The discontented nobility rallied to him, and common people, weary of Richard's extravagance, offered little resistance. By the time Richard hurried back, his power had already crumbled. Betrayed and abandoned, he was forced to surrender to Henry at Flint Castle. In September, he was compelled to abdicate before Parliament, and Henry took the throne as King Henry IV. The once glorious Richard, who had so loved the splendour of majesty, was stripped of his crown, his dignity, and his kingdom. He was imprisoned in Pontefract Castle, where, in February 1400, he died. The exact manner of his death remains shrouded in mystery. Some say starvation, others whisper of murder, but all agree it was a lonely and tragic end for a king undone by his own vanity and distrust. Thus, the reign of Richard II stands as a tale of promise wasted. He had begun as a boy of bravery, calming rebels in their fury, and he possessed genuine gifts of charm and vision. He loved beauty, art, and peace more than war, and in another time or place, these qualities might have made him a different kind of ruler. Yet in the harsh arena of late medieval England, his extravagance, pride, and mistrust sowed only division. His belief in divine right blinded him to the need for counsel and compromise, and his acts of revenge poisoned his rule. In the end, Richard's fall was as much the work of his own hand as of the nobles who dethroned him. His story, unfolding between 1377 and 1399, shows how a king who prized his own majesty above all else could lose everything, leaving behind only a cautionary shadow in the chronicles of history. Charles VI of France, 1380–1422, the mad king and a broken realm. Charles VI ascended the French throne in 1380 At only 11 years old, stepping into the shoes of his father, Charles V, a monarch remembered for restoring France after its darkest hours of the 100 Years' War, the boy king was crowned at Reims, the sacred cathedral of French kings, with the crown of St. Louis placed upon his head, and for a time the kingdom seemed steady. France, long battered by English invasions, had regained strength under his father's wise hand. But with Charles VI, destiny had other plans. Though he began with promise, his reign would become one of tragedy. His mind, once sharp, fractured into madness, plunging France into chaos. Nobles feuded, alliances splintered, and the realm itself, broken by division, slid toward ruin. The years between 1380 and 1422 would see the French monarchy fall into one of its darkest chapters, all under the shadow of a king called Charles the Mad. In his early years, regents governed in his name, for he was too young to rule alone. His uncles, the Dukes of Anjou, Berry, Burgundy and Bourbon, vied for control, each eager to enrich himself. Their greedy hands drained the treasury, and their quarrels undermined stability. Yet, as the young king grew into manhood, the people hoped he would follow his father's steadier path. And indeed, when Charles came of age, his reign began brightly. He was known as handsome, fair-haired, with bright eyes and a charm that drew loyalty. In 1388, at the age of 20, he dismissed his corrupt uncles and recalled the Marmousets, a group of capable ministers who had served his father. For a brief shining moment, France seemed poised for recovery. Laws were enforced, finances stabilized, and the crown reasserted dignity. But fate is seldom kind for long. In 1392, the storm broke. That summer, Charles set out on campaign in Brittany, leading his knights along a forested road. The sun blazed hot, the air thick with dust, when suddenly a madman leapt from the woods, seized the king's bridle, and shouted warnings of betrayal. Shaken, Charles pressed onward, but moments later, something within him snapped. His eyes grew wild, his face contorted, and with a cry, he drew his sword and turned on his own men. In a frenzy, he cut down knights beside him, slaying several before he was subdued. The horror spread quickly. The king had lost his senses. From that day, bouts of madness returned again and again, unpredictable as summer storms. Sometimes he raved and screamed. At other times he failed to recognize even his wife and children. There were moments when he believed he was made of glass, so fragile he might shatter with the slightest touch, refusing to let people near him. The court, once filled with pomp, now trembled with unease, for none could predict when the king's mind might falter. The kingdom paid the price. During his lucid intervals, Charles could still govern, but the spectre of his madness left power in the hands of others. Factions formed, each noble house eager to grasp control. Chief among them were the Dukes of Burgundy and Orleans. Philip the Bold of Burgundy first wielded great influence, but when he died in 1404, his son John the Fearless inherited both his duchy and his ambitions. Opposing him was Louis of Orleans, the king's brother, charming and extravagant, but resented for his arrogance. Rivalry turned bitter, and France became a realm not of one king, but of two feuding factions. In 1407, the feud spilled into blood. John the Fearless ordered the assassination of Louis of Orleans on the streets of Paris, his men hacking him to pieces. The killing shocked the realm, but John defended it as a righteous act, claiming Louis had bewitched the king and seduced the queen. The murder deepened division, sparking civil war between the Burgundians, who supported John, and the Armagnacs, who rallied around Orleans' heirs. France, already weakened by an unstable monarch, now tore itself apart. While French lords quarrelled, England watched and waited. Henry V, the young warrior king of England, saw opportunity in France's turmoil. In 1415 he invaded, striking at Harfleur and then marching inland. At Agincourt on the 25th of October 1415, his small force of weary men-at-arms and archers met a far larger French host. Muddy fields, heavy armour, and poor leadership doomed the French. English arrows darkened the sky, French knights stumbled and fell in heaps, and by day's end, thousands of French nobles lay dead. It was a catastrophic blow, one from which the fractured kingdom could scarcely recover. Charles VI, gripped by madness, could do nothing. The war continued not under his hand, but under the banners of feuding dukes. The tragedy deepened in 1419. John the Fearless, having dominated the Burgundian cause for years, sought peace with the Armagnacs, now led by the Dauphin Charles, the king's son. They met on a bridge at Montereau, but trust was shattered in an instant. As they parleyed, John was suddenly cut down by Dauphin's men, struck with an axe and slain at the feet of those who had promised safety. His murder ignited fresh fury. The new Duke of Burgundy, Philip the Good, turned against the Dauphin and allied instead with the English. The fragile French kingdom, already bleeding, now faced betrayal from within. By 1420, the disaster was sealed. Under the Treaty of Troyes, Charles VI, still living but broken by madness, disinherited his own son. He declared Henry V of England as his heir and regent of France. The French queen, Isabeau of Bavaria, supported the pact, and the Burgundians enforced it. Paris itself fell under English control. The Dauphin retreated south, clinging to a fragment of the kingdom, while the aging, ailing King of France sat in Paris, his crown now overshadowed by England's might. For the people, it was humiliation beyond measure. Their king lived, but their country was ruled in the name of a foreign conqueror. Charles lingered on until 1422, his mind never truly healed, his body weakened. That same year, Henry V also died unexpectedly, but Charles passed away in October, leaving behind a realm divided, humiliated, and uncertain. He had reigned for 42 years, yet his reign brought little peace or unity. His madness, his inability to govern, and the bitter rivalries it unleashed left France vulnerable at its weakest hour. And though, in time, figures like Joan of Arc would help rally the French cause, the shadow of Charles VI remained a reminder of how a kingdom could unravel when its king could not rule. The story of Charles VI is one of sorrow. He had begun with brightness, casting off corrupt regents, promising renewal. But a single fracture of the mind in 1392 altered everything. Madness does not only haunt the sufferer, it seeps into the lives of all around, and in this case, into the fate of a nation. The Dukes of Burgundy and Orleans, the massacre at Agincourt, the shame of Troyes, all were shaped by the absence of steady kingship. France endured not only the ravages of war with England, but the torment of civil strife, all while its rightful king wandered in delusions, unable to recognize his own family, convinced at times that he was no longer even flesh and bone. In this way, Charles VI's reign became not merely the story of a broken monarch, but of a broken realm. Wenceslas of the Romans, 1378-1400, a drunken emperor's disgrace. When Charles IV, one of the most capable Holy Roman emperors, passed away in 1378, the empire he had strengthened fell into the hands of his son Wenceslas. At only 17, the young king of Bohemia inherited not only the Bohemian throne, but also the dignity of King of the Romans, the title reserved for the man meant to become emperor. His father had built stability through careful diplomacy, nurturing Prague as a radiant capital of learning and culture, even establishing the first university north of the Alps. But Wenceslaus, who was meant to carry this legacy forward, would instead squander it. In the decades of his rule, from 1378 to 1400, his reign became infamous for idleness, drunkenness, and neglect. The chroniclers of his time often described him not as a sovereign, but as a man more at home in taverns than in councils, more concerned with his cups of wine than the affairs of his vast dominion. For this, he earned a reputation as one of Europe's most ineffective and disreputable kings. Wenceslas's early years as ruler of Bohemia already showed troubling signs. Though intelligent enough, he lacked discipline and seriousness. He left matters of state unattended, withdrawing from the weight of governance into hunting, feasting, and drinking. His contemporaries complained that he ignored petitions, failed to attend court sessions, and dismissed the concerns of nobles and clergy alike. The empire, a delicate patchwork of states, required careful arbitration to keep peace among its princes, yet Wenceslaus rarely intervened, allowing disputes to fester. As one chronicler noted, he was a king, better suited to the cellar than the throne. In 1378, at the very moment he ascended, Europe was already trembling under the strain of the great schism of the Church. Two popes, one in Rome and one in Avignon, each claimed legitimacy, and Christendom was torn between them. The Holy Roman Emperor, as secular protector of the Church, was expected to play a decisive role. But Wenceslaus proved paralysed. While his father Charles IV had balanced papal politics with grace, Wenceslaus drifted aimlessly, offering no resolution. German princes, bishops, and electors looked for leadership, but found only indifference. The crisis deepened, and the empire's prestige waned, for its king was absent in both body and spirit. As years passed, Wenceslaus's neglect grew worse. Chroniclers describe his drunken binges, when he would vanish for days, leaving governance in disarray. His courtiers and ministers, frustrated by his negligence, often ruled in his stead, though they lacked his authority. Bohemia itself began to unravel. The nobility, sensing weakness, pressed their advantages, carving out more power for themselves. Justice faltered, corruption spread. In Prague, unrest simmered, not only among nobles but also among commoners who felt abandoned. The realm that Charles IV had carefully knit together began to fray under the weight of Wenceslaus's inattention. His personal cruelty also stained his rule. When outraged churchmen dared to confront him over his failings, Wenceslaus responded with violence. In 1393, the case of John of Nepomuk became infamous. John, a priest and vicar general, refused to reveal the Queen's confession to the king. In a drunken rage, Wenceslaus had him arrested, tortured, and ultimately drowned in the Vltava River. The act horrified contemporaries and cast a lasting shadow over his reign. Centuries later, John of Nepomuk would be venerated as a saint, a martyr of conscience, while Wenceslaus was remembered as a tyrant incapable of restraint. Yet cruelty did not translate into control. The German princes, long accustomed to a weak emperor, grew restless under his rule. They complained that Wenceslaus never attended imperial diets, that he failed to enforce laws, that he abandoned his duty to preserve the peace of the empire. Banditry flourished across the roads of Germany, with robber barons terrorizing merchants, seizing castles, and extorting tolls. The Reich's cohesion depended on an emperor who could impose order. Instead, they had a king known for staggering through Prague's taverns. By 1400, the princes had grown weary of the farce. Gathering at Larnac Castle and later at Oberlahnstein, the electors made a bold move. They deposed Wenceslaus as king of the Romans. It was one of the rare occasions in medieval history when a king was formally deposed by his peers. Their justification was plain: he had failed his duties, abandoned the empire, and allowed disorder to reign. In his place, they elected Rupert of the Palatinate. Wenceslaus, however, refused to acknowledge his removal. From Bohemia, he continued to claim the title, though few took him seriously. His reign as king of the Romans had collapsed into ignominy, and he spent the rest of his life more as a local king of Bohemia than as a true emperor. In his later years, Wenceslaus lived much as he had always done, drinking, feasting, and avoiding the burdens of state. His reputation was so stained that even his contemporaries found little to praise. While some kings left monuments, reforms, or victories, Wenceslaus left only the memory of squandered opportunity. He had inherited one of the most promising positions in Europe, the heir to Charles IV, with a stable Bohemian realm and the dignity of Roman kingship. But through negligence and indulgence, he squandered both. By the time of his death in 1419, he left Bohemia in turmoil, with religious dissent rising under figures like Jan Hus. unrest that would soon erupt into the Hussite Wars. The legacy of Wenceslaus thus lies not in achievements, but in failures. He showed how a ruler's personal vices, indolence, drunkenness, cruelty, neglect could undermine an entire realm. His reign weakened both Bohemia and the empire, leaving them vulnerable to crises that followed. He remains remembered as a cautionary tale, the drunken emperor who, through his own folly, lost the respect of his people and the dignity of his crown. Henry VIII of England, 1509–1547, a tyrant's vanity and ruin. Henry VIII came to the throne in 1509, a young man of just 17, broad-shouldered, handsome, athletic, and hailed as the hope of a new age. In those early years, his people rejoiced in him. He was everything a Renaissance prince was supposed to be, educated in Latin, French, and theology, skilled in music and poetry, powerful in jousting and sport. His reign began with optimism, and to those who looked upon him, it seemed that England would enjoy a golden era under this vibrant king. Yet beneath the surface, there already stirred a restlessness, an impatience, and a pride that would harden with time into vanity, cruelty, and tyranny. Over nearly 4 decades, Henry would turn England inside out, shattering its religious unity, bankrupting its treasury, tormenting his wives, executing his closest allies, and indulging his whims until his own health collapsed. His story is one of dazzling beginnings followed by slow, grinding ruin, the portrait of a king who ruled not for his people, but for himself. In the first years of his rule, Henry VIII was determined to prove himself as more than a youth on the throne. The great powers of Europe, France, Spain, the Holy Roman Empire dominated politics, and Henry longed to stand among them. War seemed the surest path to glory, and so in 1513 he launched a campaign in France. Though minor in scope, it gave him what he craved. Victories at the sieges of Terouanne and Tournai, celebrated in England as if he had rivaled Caesar. At home he poured treasure into tournaments, feasts and palaces, surrounding himself with music and splendour. The people loved him still, for their king was not the shadowy figure of court but the living embodiment of youth, vigour and promise. But kingship is a long game, and Henry was no patient strategist. His vanity grew with every compliment, and his anger flared with every obstacle. Most consuming of all was his obsession with securing a male heir. Married to Catherine of Aragon, widow of his brother Arthur, Henry expected children swiftly, yet while Catherine bore him several children, most died in infancy. Only Mary, born in 1516, survived. To Henry this was no small disappointment. In a world where dynasties toppled without male succession, he saw the Tudor line endangered. Catherine aged, and Henry's impatience curdled into resentment. His gaze wandered toward younger women, and his conscience, or rather his pride, began to whisper that perhaps his marriage had never been valid in the eyes of God. By the mid-1522, Henry had become infatuated with Anne Boleyn, a lady-in-waiting at court. Clever, ambitious, and unwilling to be only a mistress, Anne demanded marriage. For Henry, this affair became an all-consuming crisis. To wed Anne, he needed his first marriage annulled. In 1527, he appealed to Pope Clement VII, insisting that Catherine's union with his brother made their marriage cursed. But the Pope, under the shadow of Catherine's powerful nephew, Emperor Charles V, hesitated. Years dragged on. Henry's temper burned hotter. He was not used to being denied. The man who once seemed the jewel of Christendom now grew frustrated, paranoid, and vindictive. It was in this crucible of desire and pride that Henry made the decision that would define not only his reign, but England for centuries. He broke with Rome. By 1533, having secretly married Anne Boleyn, Henry forced the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, to declare his marriage to Catherine null and his new union lawful. In 1534, Parliament passed the Act of Supremacy, proclaiming Henry the supreme head of the Church of England. With this, centuries of English loyalty to the Catholic Church ended. The monasteries were dissolved, their lands seized, their treasures stripped. To Henry, it was triumph. His will had overcome the Pope himself. To his subjects, it was a convulsion. The world they had known all their lives was unmade. But even victory could not satisfy Henry's restless spirit. Anne Boleyn, the woman for whom he had overturned Christendom, bore him only one surviving child, Elizabeth, in 1533. By 1536, with no son and with rumours of infidelity swirling, Henry's affection curdled into rage. Anne was arrested, tried on charges of adultery and treason, and executed by sword. Days later, Henry married Jane Seymour, who at last gave him the son he so desperately sought, Edward, born in 1537. Jane, however, died soon after childbirth. Henry mourned her more sincerely than his other wives, but his grief did not soften his rule. He grew heavier, his once athletic body swelling with obesity, and his temper more unpredictable. The later years of his reign became a cycle of marriages and executions, treaties and betrayals, grand feasts followed by ruthless purges. Anne of Cleves, whom Henry married for political alliance, was discarded within months, mocked by Henry as unattractive. Catherine Howard, young and vivacious, was executed for alleged adultery in 1542. Finally came Catherine Parr, who outlived him, a nurse to his failing body and a steady hand in his waning years. Around him, ministers rose and fell with dizzying speed. Thomas More, once his loyal counsellor, was executed for refusing to accept the king's supremacy over the church. Thomas Cromwell, architect of the Reformation, was himself sent to the block when he lost Henry's favour. As the 1542nd drew on, Henry's body betrayed him. Ulcers festered in his legs. He could scarcely walk. Once the Golden Prince, he now had to be carried about, his massive frame bloated, his face ruddy with illness. Yet his cruelty did not abate. Thousands had died under his rule, from humble monks to noble courtiers, from innocent wives to foreign foes. His vanity had consumed England's wealth, his religious upheaval had set neighbour against neighbour, and his thirst for glory had embroiled the nation in costly wars that yielded little. Still, he imagined himself as a monarch of greatness, a king who bent heaven and earth to his will. When Henry died in 1547, aged 55, his legacy was a kingdom transformed and traumatized. His son Edward VI was but a child, destined to die young. His daughter Mary would attempt to restore Catholicism with fire and blood. His daughter Elizabeth would inherit a fractured nation and strive to heal it. The England Henry left behind was not the England he inherited. Where once faith had united his people, now suspicion and division reigned. Where once monarchy had promised stability, now uncertainty loomed. The splendour of his youth had curdled into the terror of his old age. And so, Henry VIII stands among history's worst kings, not because he lacked intelligence, or power, or will. He possessed all three in abundance, but he wielded them not for the good of his people, but for his vanity, his passions, and his whims. He destroyed what he could not control, and he spent lives like coin in pursuit of his desires. His reign was a mirror of his own body, beginning in strength and beauty, ending in decay and corruption. Charles VI of France, 1380–1422. The Mad King and a Broken Realm. Charles VI of France inherited the crown at the tender age of 11 in 1380. His reign would stretch for more than 4 decades, a long arc in which the promise of a bright beginning was steadily consumed by shadows. To his people, he would become known not as Charles the Beloved, which some had once called him, but as Charles the Mad. His story unfolds against the backdrop of a kingdom already scarred by war, famine, and plague. France, in the late 14th century, was still reeling from the 100 Years' War with England, a conflict that had begun in 1337 and would drag on until 1453. The Black Death had swept across Europe only a generation before, thinning populations and leaving fields fallow. When Charles ascended the throne, there was hope that youth might bring renewal. Instead, His reign would be marked by instability, corruption, civil war, and madness, so deep that the king often did not know he was king at all. At first, things looked promising. During his minority, power rested in the hands of his uncles Dukes of Anjou, Burgundy, Berry, and Bourbon, men ambitious and greedy, who drained the treasury for their own ends. But when Charles came of age in 1388, he asserted himself. He dismissed the uncles and called back his father's old advisors, known as the marmosets, men of greater competence. For a few short years, reforms were enacted. Taxes were moderated, corruption curbed, and the kingdom seemed to breathe more easily. The young king, handsome and vigorous, rode out with his knights and presided over tournaments. His people cheered, believing France might yet find stability after decades of turmoil. But fate is cruel, and in the summer of 1392 it struck with sudden violence. That year, Charles set out on a campaign in Brittany, meant to punish a rebellious lord. On the march through the forest of Le Mans, the king was suddenly seized by madness. Accounts say he drew his sword, screaming that traitors surrounded him, and struck down his own men, killing several before he was subdued. When he came to, he seemed not to remember what he had done. At first, courtiers hoped it was but a passing frenzy, yet it was the beginning of a lifetime of recurring attacks that would define his reign. The fits came unpredictably. Sometimes Charles would wander the palace corridors, refusing to recognize his wife, Queen Isabeau of Bavaria, or his children. At other times, he believed he was made of glass, and would have iron rods sewn into his clothes to prevent himself from shattering. He raged at servants, fled from shadows, or sat for hours in silence. During lucid intervals, he wept over his condition, begging forgiveness from God. These episodes were not merely personal tragedies, they destabilized the kingdom itself. A medieval monarchy relied on the person of the king as the axis of authority. With Charles incapacitated, factions at court grew powerful, each seeking to rule in his stead. Into this vacuum stepped his uncles once more, along with his brother Louis of Orleans, and later the powerful Dukes of Burgundy. Queen Isabeau, finding herself tied to a husband who drifted between lucidity and madness, also became a political actor. The court fractured into rival camps, each manipulating the king's moments of clarity to gain signatures, decrees, and favours. For the ordinary people of France, this meant rising taxes, neglect of governance, and the ever-present dread of renewed war with England. By the early 1402, the realm was sliding into open civil war. The rivalry between the Burgundians, led by John the Fearless, and the Armagnacs, partisans of the Duke of Orleans, split France into hostile factions. Paris itself became a battleground of intrigue and bloodshed. In 1407, Duke Louis of Orleans was assassinated in the streets of Paris on orders from John of Burgundy. This murder shocked the kingdom, but instead of restoring order, it deepened the spiral of vengeance. The Burgundians and Armagnacs each claimed to act in the king's name, though the king himself was often lost in madness, unable to speak more than a few coherent words. The people of France, weary and suffering, looked upon their monarch and saw not a figure of unity but a broken man, his crown slipping from his grasp. The kingdom's enemies were not blind to this weakness. England, under King Henry V, pressed its advantage. In 1415, the English achieved a devastating victory at the Battle of Agincourt, slaughtering thousands of French knights and nobles. Charles VI, incapacitated by madness, could do nothing to rally his country. His son, the Dauphin Charles, tried to resist, but France was riven by its own internal feuds. The depth of humiliation came in 1420 with the Treaty of Troyes. Manipulated by the Burgundians and abandoned by his queen, Charles was compelled to sign away the future of his kingdom. The treaty recognized Henry V of England as heir to the French throne, disinheriting the Dauphin. For the first time, it seemed that France might vanish altogether, absorbed into an Anglo-French empire. The King of France had, in effect, signed his own dynasty's death warrant. though his madness likely left him scarcely aware of the full implications. When Charles VI died in 1422, after 42 years on the throne, the kingdom was fractured, humiliated, and exhausted. The crown passed not to his son, but on paper, at least to Henry V of England and his infant son Henry VI. Yet the French would not accept this quietly. The Dauphin, supported by loyalists, would fight on, and in time, a peasant girl from Domremy, Joan of Arc, would arise to lead armies in his name. Still, the scars left by Charles VI were deep. Why, then, is Charles VI remembered among the worst kings in history? It is not for cruelty or vanity, like Henry VIII, nor for incompetence alone. It is because, in him, the very idea of kingship collapsed. He could not rule, yet he could not be replaced. His madness allowed corruption to thrive, civil war to erupt, and foreign enemies to triumph. France suffered not just from his condition, but from the structures of monarchy itself, which had no answer to the question of what to do when the king was alive but not truly present. His reign is a tragic reminder of how fragile kingdoms can be when built upon the shoulders of one man. In the 14th century, when feudal loyalties and royal authority were the glue of society, the king's madness was not merely personal, it was national. His subjects called him Charles the Mad, and in their voices was mingled pity, fear, and despair. They saw in him the unravelling of order itself, and the long shadow of his broken mind would linger in France for decades after his death. Ivan IV of Russia, 1547-1584, the terrible Tsar and the birth of autocracy. Ivan Vasilievich, later known to the world as Ivan the Terrible, came into the world in August of 1530 in the red-bricked fortress of Kolomenskoye near Moscow, at a time when Russia was still a collection of struggling principalities bound under the Grand Duchy of Muscovy. His birth occurred in an age where kingdoms in Europe trembled under Reformation, where the Ottoman sultans extended their power across the Mediterranean, and where Renaissance ideas had begun to circulate even into the northern courts. Russia itself, isolated and shaped by centuries of Mongol rule, was still raw, hard, and deeply suspicious of the world outside. In such a climate, the boy who would grow into the first crowned Tsar of all Russia opened his eyes, and from the first moments of his life, the shadows of tragedy and ambition pressed heavily upon him. His father, Vasily III, Grand Prince of Moscow, died when Ivan was only 3. In those days, regencies were breeding grounds for intrigue, and his mother, Elena Glinskaya, tried desperately to hold the reins of power on behalf of her infant son. But she too died suddenly, perhaps poisoned, when Ivan was only 8. From then on, the boy was surrounded by the feuding noble families of Russia, the boyars, who schemed in the halls of the Kremlin and treated the orphaned heir less like a prince and more like a pawn. He was alternately neglected and humiliated, wandering the palace half-starved, clothing torn, yet watching keenly, memorizing the way men wielded cruelty and deception as naturally as breathing. It was in these years, in the early 1542, that the roots of Ivan's later paranoia sank deep as he learned to trust no one and to harbour his rage in silence. By 1547, at just 17 years of age, Ivan took a step that marked a turning point not only in his own life, but in Russian history. On a frosty January day, in the Cathedral of the Dormition within the Kremlin, he was crowned not merely as Grand Prince, but as Tsar of all Rus. The title, drawn from the Roman Caesar, carried immense weight. It signalled to the world that Russia was no longer a loose confederation of lands, but an empire in its own right. With the glittering crown upon his head and the ancient regalia in his hands, Ivan proclaimed himself more than a ruler by inheritance. He was chosen, divinely sanctioned, a sovereign standing equal to emperors and sultans. For a time, the coronation seemed to herald a new dawn. Ivan, still young and full of ambition, surrounded himself with reform-minded advisors. Known as the Chosen Council, this group urged the modernization of the realm. Together they instituted reforms, standardizing laws under the Sudebnik of 1550, reforming the military, creating a standing army of streltsy armed with firearms, and calling the first Zemski Sobor, an assembly of representatives from across the land. These measures suggested that Russia might march toward a more orderly, even just governance, a hopeful contrast to the lawlessness of his childhood. Ivan even embarked on projects to strengthen the church and expand education, gestures that for a time painted him as a reformer rather than a tyrant. Yet history has a way of turning light into shadow. The years that followed revealed the darker side of Ivan's nature, sharpened by the personal tragedies that struck his life. In 1560, his beloved first wife, Anastasia Romanovna, died again, perhaps poisoned by nobles who despised her family's influence. Ivan was consumed by grief and fury, and suspicion hardened into certainty in his mind. The boyars, those ancient aristocrats, were plotting endlessly against him. He became convinced that only terror could preserve his throne. Thus began the period that defined his reign, the Oprichnina declared in 1565. Ivan divided the land of Russia into two spheres. One, the Zemshchina, remained under the traditional administration. The other, the Oprichnina, was his personal domain, ruled by terror. To enforce his will, he created the Oprichniki, a corps of black-clad enforcers who rode dark horses and carried severed dogs' heads and brooms, as symbols: the dog's head to sniff out treason, the broom to sweep it away. These men unleashed unspeakable cruelties on towns, villages, and noble families, confiscating lands, executing suspected traitors, and spreading fear like wildfire. The most infamous episode came in 1570, when Ivan turned his wrath upon the prosperous city of Novgorod, long a centre of trade and relative independence. Accusing its citizens of treachery, of conspiring with Poland-Lithuania, Ivan marched his forces into the city during the bitter cold of winter. Over several weeks, thousands were slaughtered, men, women, children, their bodies hurled into the freezing Volkhov River. Churches were looted, the economy crippled, and the memory of Novgorod's massacre etched terror into the very soul of Russia. This event, among others, showed how Ivan's paranoia had curdled into madness, and how the vision of a strong empire was being drowned in blood. And yet, even as he tore his own land apart, Ivan pursued dreams of expansion. He launched campaigns eastward against the Khanats of Kazan and Astrakhan, remnants of the Mongol Golden Horde. Victories there in the 1552nd and early 1562nd extended Russia's dominion to the Volga, opening new avenues of trade and symbolizing the final triumph over Mongol domination. The capture of Kazan in 1552 was celebrated with the construction of St. Basil's Cathedral, whose brightly coloured domes still stand as one of Moscow's most iconic sites. In these conquests, Ivan revealed the duality of his reign, builder and destroyer, visionary and tyrant. But westward, his ambitions met disaster. Ivan sought to secure a window to the Baltic, launching the Livonian War in 1558 to capture access to the sea and secure trade routes to Europe. At first, his armies surged forward, but the conflict dragged on for decades, draining resources, inviting intervention from Poland, Lithuania, Sweden, and even the rising power of the Crimean Tatars. By the 1572nd and 1582nd, Russia was exhausted, its treasury empty, its people crushed under taxation and conscription. The war ended in failure, leaving Ivan's dream of a Baltic empire shattered. His personal life mirrored the turmoil of his reign. Tormented by guilt and fury, Ivan lashed out even at his own family. In 1581, during a fit of rage, he struck his son and heir, Ivan Ivanovich, with his staff, killing him. The image of the Tsar cradling his dying son has haunted Russia's memory ever since, a tragic emblem of a man who destroyed even his own bloodline. With his death in 1584, Ivan left the throne to his weaker son Fyodor, setting Russia on a path toward the time of troubles, a period of famine, civil war, and foreign invasion. Looking back across the span of his reign, from 1547 to 1584, Ivan IV was both the architect of Russian autocracy and the embodiment of its dangers. He centralized power, expanded territory, and carved the title of Tsar into the identity of Russia. But he also terrorized his own people, devastated the nobility, and left his country weaker than it might have been. Abroad, Europe watched with mingled fascination and horror, while Elizabeth I reigned in England, guiding her kingdom into an age of exploration and cultural brilliance, and while the Ottoman Empire under Suleiman and his successors reached the height of its majesty, Russia under Ivan became a land feared for its cruelty, its violence, and its unpredictability. And so Ivan earned his epithet, Grozny, often translated as terrible. It more closely means the formidable, the awe-inspiring, the dreaded. He was not simply monstrous, but immense, a figure who inspired both reverence and terror. In the dark cadence of his reign, Russia learned the price of unchecked power, and the legacy of Ivan the Terrible remained, echoing into the centuries that followed. Charles VI of France, 1380–1422, the Mad King in a kingdom at war. Charles VI of France came into the world on the 3rd of December, 1368, in Paris, at a time when the 100 Years' War raged on between France and England. He was the son of King Charles V, a monarch remembered as wise and deliberate, who had guided his realm with patience and care during his reign. For a brief moment, hope lingered that the boy would inherit the same wisdom and strength, that France, weary of endless conflict, might find steadier ground. Yet the story that unfolded across the 4 decades of his rule would prove otherwise. His reign, stretching from 1380 to 1422, would be one of turmoil, of fragile beginnings collapsing into madness, of a kingdom unraveling under the strain of both war abroad and treachery within. Charles ascended to the throne as a child of only 11 years old, upon the death of his father in September of 1380. Too young to rule in his own right, the kingdom fell into the hands of regents his uncles from the powerful Valois line, men like the Dukes of Burgundy, Anjou, and Berry. These princes governed not with the restraint of Charles V, but with greed and ambition. They taxed heavily, drained the treasury, and stirred resentment across the realm. The peasants, already weary from decades of conflict and plague, simmered with discontent. Paris, the heart of the kingdom, fumed under the weight of misrule. The memory of the Jacquerie, the peasant uprising of 1358, was still fresh, and though Charles was too young to grasp it, the crown rested upon a fragile foundation. By 1388, Charles had reached 20 years of age, and with a youthful determination he dismissed his uncles from power, replacing them with trusted advisors known as the marmosets. These men were reformers, eager to restore order and competence to the government. For a few years, France began to breathe easier. Finances stabilized, taxes were managed with greater care, and the war with England was handled with more deliberate strategy. Charles himself earned admiration as the beloved Charles le Bien-Aimé, a monarch who seemed destined to carry forward the careful stewardship of his father. The young king was known for his grace, his charm, his devotion to justice, and for a short time, France seemed poised for recovery. But fate was cruel, and it was in 1392 that disaster struck. That summer, Charles set out on a military expedition against Brittany, determined to punish a rebellious nobleman. Riding under the blazing sun, the heat oppressive and the march long, the king was already strained by exhaustion. Then, without warning, he suffered a sudden break. Accounts describe how, as he rode in his armour, a man stumbled into the procession carrying a spear, and the clatter of weapons startled Charles. His eyes glazed over, and in a frenzy he turned upon his own men. Sword drawn, he cut down 4 knights before being restrained. When the fit passed, he collapsed into confusion, his mind clouded and his spirit fractured. From that moment on, Charles's reign entered a darker chapter. The king would suffer repeated bouts of madness for the rest of his life. At times, he failed to recognize even his own wife, Queen Isabeau of Bavaria, or his children. He raved that he was made of glass and would shatter if touched, forcing his attendants to wrap him in reinforced clothing. He wandered the corridors of his palaces in confusion, muttering prayers or screaming in terror, convinced that demons pursued him. On other occasions, he fell into long silences, withdrawn from the affairs of state, unable to lift a hand in governance. These attacks could last weeks or months, leaving France without clear leadership. During his periods of lucidity, Charles grieved over his condition, aware that his weakness endangered the realm, yet his awareness did little to halt the decline. His illness created a vacuum of power, and into that void stepped ambitious factions, eager to rule in his stead. The Queen, Isabeau, allied herself at times with the Dukes of Burgundy, at other times with the rival faction of Orléans. The dukes, meanwhile, manoeuvred to expand their influence, using the king's incapacity as justification for their control. The struggle between the Burgundians and the Armagnacs, the supporters of the Duke of Orléans, tore France apart from within. Paris became a battleground of rival mobs, with assassinations and riots staining the streets. The most shocking moment came in 1407, when Louis, Duke of Orléans, was murdered in Paris by agents of John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy. The killing ignited a civil war within France, pitting Burgundian against Armagnac and plunging the kingdom deeper into chaos. This internal division could not have come at a worse time, for England had not forgotten its claims to the French throne. While France fought itself, the English prepared their armies. In 1415, Henry V of England crossed the Channel and met the French at Agincourt. The French knights, weighed down by armour and bogged in mud, were slaughtered by English longbowmen. The defeat was catastrophic, a humiliation that echoed across Europe. France, weakened by civil war and governed by a king lost to madness, could not resist effectively. In 1420, the disaster was sealed with the Treaty of Troyes. Signed by Isabeau of Bavaria and the Burgundian faction, the treaty disinherited Charles's own son, the Dauphin Charles, and recognised Henry V of England as the heir to the French crown. The deal was a staggering betrayal, for it meant that upon Charles VI's death, the Kingdom of France was to pass into English hands. The king, confused and broken, was little more than a symbol as the crown itself slipped from French fingers. When Charles VI finally died in October of 1422, at the age of 53, he was remembered not as the beloved, but as the mad. His death left France shattered, occupied by English forces in the north, and torn apart by the rivalries of Burgundy and Orléans. His reign, lasting 42 years, had transformed the kingdom from one of tentative recovery to one of near ruin. And yet, even in the midst of his failures, the seeds of France's eventual recovery were sown. The disinherited Dauphin would rally resistance in the south, and figures like Joan of Arc would rise in the years after Charles's death to turn the tide. But in the story of Charles VI himself, one finds the tragedy of a man born to kingship, undone by an illness no one could cure, whose crown became a burden heavier than he could bear. He was, in the judgment of history, one of Europe's worst kings, not because of cruelty, like Ivan the Terrible, nor because of vice, like Nero, but because of weakness. His mind betrayed him, and through that betrayal, his kingdom nearly perished. France endured decades of suffering, humiliation, and near collapse under his reign, a testament to how fragile monarchy could be when the man at its centre faltered. George IV of Britain, 1820–1830, the self-indulgent monarch of a changing age. George Augustus Frederick, born on the 12th of August 1762 at St James's Palace in London, entered the world as the eldest son of King George III and Queen Charlotte. His birth was celebrated with great fanfare, for he was heir apparent to the throne of Britain, a kingdom already becoming the hub of global commerce and empire. Yet from the beginning, George was raised in a court where discipline and austerity were expected, guided by his father's stern morality and frugal habits. The young prince, however, grew into a man who rejected restraint, who embraced indulgence, and whose tastes, excesses, and scandals would come to define his reign as George IV. By the late 18th century, Europe was in upheaval. Across the Channel, the French Revolution erupted in 1789, shattering thrones and aristocratic privileges. In Britain, the Industrial Revolution gathered force, transforming towns into bustling centres of manufacture and drawing the poor into smoky cities filled with factories. The Napoleonic Wars, spanning 1799 to 1815, tested the resilience of Britain as never before, binding the kingdom in a struggle for survival. Amid these seismic shifts, the Prince of Wales, as George was styled before his accession, seemed less a leader in waiting than a figure adrift in luxury. In his youth, George became notorious for extravagance. He commissioned the building of Carlton House in London, a mansion of grandeur filled with gilded furniture, fine paintings, and lavish entertainments. He ran up immense debts, often beyond what Parliament could tolerate, and was bailed out repeatedly by political deals that tied him more closely to his father's ministers. He cultivated a circle of artists, actors, and mistresses, surrounding himself with the fashionable world of Regency England. He was witty, charming, and often generous, but equally reckless and dissolute. One of the great scandals of his early life was his marriage. In 1785, at the age of 23, George secretly wed Maria Fitzherbert, a Roman Catholic widow. The marriage was legally invalid under the Royal Marriages Act of 1772, which required the king's consent, and because Catholics were barred from marrying heirs to the throne. Yet the relationship endured, secret and scandalous, a mark of George's determination to follow his own desires rather than the strictures of law or duty. In 1795, pressed by Parliament and burdened with debts, he married his cousin, Princess Caroline of Brunswick. The union was a disaster. The two despised each other almost immediately. George mocked her manners and appearance. Caroline ridiculed his gluttony and indulgence. They lived apart soon after their daughter, Princess Charlotte, was born in 1796, and the marriage became a subject of ridicule across Britain. When King George III's mind failed in 1811, Parliament appointed the Prince of Wales as Prince Regent, entrusting him with the effective rule of the kingdom. Thus began the Regency era, remembered today as a period of elegance in fashion, architecture, and the arts. George, as regent, became the great patron of this cultural flowering. He supported painters like Sir Thomas Lawrence, architects like John Nash, and writers who thrived in this age of refinement. He transformed Brighton with the construction of the Royal Pavilion, an exotic palace of domes and minarets, blending Indian and Chinese styles in a flourish of fantasy. He commissioned the remodelling of Windsor Castle and oversaw the beginnings of what would become Regent Street in London. Yet while his taste for art and architecture enriched Britain's cultural heritage, his governance was less admired. During the long struggle against Napoleon, he offered little in the way of strategy or vision, leaving the task to ministers like William Pitt the Younger and later Lord Liverpool. After Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo in 1815, Britain stood as the greatest power in Europe, but at home unrest simmered. Returning soldiers faced poverty, workers protested against industrial conditions, and radicals demanded reform. George, however, seemed detached from these struggles, preferring banquets and balls to the cries of his people. When his father finally died in 1820, George ascended the throne as George IV. By then he was 57 years old, grossly overweight, and suffering from gout and other ailments. His coronation was planned as a spectacle of unprecedented magnificence, costing nearly £250,000, a staggering sum at the time, and featuring elaborate costumes and decorations. Yet the grandeur was marred by scandal, for Queen Caroline, though estranged, attempted to attend the coronation and was barred from the doors of Westminster Abbey. The scene of her humiliation, watched by crowds, deepened public sympathy for her and intensified dislike of the king. George IV's reign, lasting only a decade, was marked by contradictions. On the one hand, he continued his patronage of the arts, leaving a legacy of buildings, paintings, and cultural institutions that still define London's landscape. On the other hand, his personal reputation was in ruins. He was mocked for his obesity, his drunkenness, and his inability to restrain his appetites. Satirical cartoons depicted him as a bloated figure, a king more concerned with indulgence than duty. Politically, he resisted reform. He opposed efforts to expand voting rights, and his government cracked down harshly on protests, such as the Peterloo Massacre of 1819, where cavalry charged into a crowd demanding parliamentary representation, killing and injuring dozens. Yet under his reign, one of the most significant changes in Britain's religious landscape occurred. The Catholic Emancipation Act of 1829. Though George personally opposed it, fearing it would endanger the Protestant establishment, political pressure forced its passage. The Act allowed Catholics to sit in Parliament and hold public office, a step toward religious equality that reshaped Britain's political system. By the end of his reign, George IV was a lonely figure. His beloved daughter, Princess Charlotte, who had promised a brighter future for the monarchy, had died in childbirth in 1817. His brothers quarrelled among themselves, and he remained estranged from his wife until her death in 1821. He grew more reclusive, retreating to Windsor and Brighton, indulging in food and drink, his health steadily failing. On the 26th of June, 1830, George IV died at Windsor Castle, aged 67. His reign had not been marked by great victories or sweeping reforms, but by extravagance, scandal, and cultural patronage. Historians would later judge him harshly, calling him selfish, irresponsible, and among the worst of Britain's kings. Yet the buildings he left behind, the Pavilion at Brighton, the remodel of Windsor, the streets of London he helped shape endure as reminders of his peculiar legacy. In the rhythm of history, George IV represents the paradox of monarchy in the modern age. A man whose personal failings overshadowed his role, but whose love of beauty left a lasting imprint. He was, by all accounts, a poor king, but also a great patron. In the balance, he remains remembered less for statesmanship than for indulgence, less for leadership than for lavishness, a monarch of glittering surfaces and hollow depths. When the long parade of monarchs has faded into silence, their crowns set aside, their palaces empty, what lingers is not the weight of their titles, but the lessons carried forward. Across centuries, kings rose and fell, their power shaped by ambition, fear, greed, or folly. Some left their kingdoms fractured, others left them scarred, and still others linger in memory only as warnings of how authority may drift into excess. And yet, history itself, slow and patient, continues beyond them. The people they ruled, the cities they touched, the cultures that endured all carried on when each monarch's voice fell quiet. Even the worst of kings, those who governed poorly, who chose indulgence over duty or cruelty over compassion, were swept away by time, leaving space for renewal, reform, and the chance for better rulers to follow. As you drift now toward rest, imagine the crowns set down in dusty halls, their jewels dim in the moonlight, their brilliance fading into stillness. The echoes of battles soften, the cries of protest quiet. The weight of power dissolves into the quiet rhythm of history's endless turning. All rulers pass, and all empires fade, yet the night remains constant, carrying each story into the hush of memory. Breathe gently, and let the noise of their reigns dissolve into calm. You have walked through the shadows of ambition and ruin, and now you may let them go. The stories are complete, their lessons told. Settle now into silence, assured that the world moves always onward, leaving behind the turmoil of kings, carrying only the steady hum of time. Rest, as the centuries close around you, and let sleep carry you gently forward.